Komið blessuð og sæl. Hi and welcome back to Icelandic for Foreigners. In this video, we're going to be going over some of the main uses of the word SEM. Let's get started. Now, particularly, we're going to be talking about three different uses. First is as a relative pronoun, which is the most common use, and we're going to be spending the most time on it. Second is using it to mean as or like, and we'll look at some examples of that. And the last one is when we use it with a question word and ever, like whatever or however, and I'll talk about that more when we get to it. So let's talk first about using it as a relative pronoun. Now, a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. And what a relative clause is it gives extra information about a noun or a pronoun that we're already talking about. So rather than trying to explain this theoretically, I'll just give you an example. Here's your Icelandic example and the English example below it. Bókin sem þú gafst mér skemmtileg, and that means the book that you gave me is fun. Now, those words in the brackets, that you gave me, is extra information about the book. If you may notice, if you take out the words that you gave me, we still have a complete sentence. The book is fun. But we can add in the relative clause to give more information about the book. The book that you gave me is fun. Relative clauses function the same way in Icelandic. Now in English, we have several different relative pronouns we can use. You can say which, that, where, who, or not use a relative pronoun at all. Let's look at some examples. The car that I drive is old. So here the relative clause is that I drive, and we use that to introduce the relative clause. But we can also say the car which I drive is old, and it means the same thing, and this is really just a stylistic difference in English. You can also just say the car I drive is old, and not even use a relative pronoun. When you're describing a person, you can use the relative pronoun who, like in the sentence, the person who sold me this car is a crook. In this case, we can also use that. The person that sold me this car is a crook. And sometimes we use where when we're describing a place. The place where I park my car is not safe. So in English, we have a lot of ways to introduce a relative clause. But the nice thing about Icelandic is there's only one relative pronoun, sem. Every time we have a relative clause, we're going to use sem. So we can say, Bíllinn sem ég keypti blár, which means the car that I bought is blue, or in English, just the car I bought is blue. You can say it either way, but in Icelandic, we just use sem. Maðurinn sem seldi mér hann var góður. This in English would translate to the man who sold me it was nice. So even when in English we would use who, in Icelandic we're just going to use sem. Or bílastæðið þar sem ég legg honum öruggt. Means the lot where I park it is safe, and we use sem again. Particularly we use sem, which is often used when you're talking about a place in Icelandic, to say the place where I did something. One other thing you need to know about this relative pronoun in Icelandic is that it cannot be dropped from the sentence. Earlier we looked at an English example, the car that I drive is old. And we also noticed that you can drop the word that and just say, the car I drive is old. But in Icelandic, you can't drop the word sem. You have to leave it in the sentence whenever there's a relative clause. So for example, Bíllinn sem ég keypti blár, which means the car that I bought is blue. We cannot drop sem and say Bíllinn ég keypti blár. That's not an option in Icelandic. You have to use sem. All right, also remember that sem can be used with pronouns too. Here's an example. Sá sem hringdi í mig var ekki mjög kurteis would mean the one who called me was not very polite. In this case, the relative clause is describing sá, which is a pronoun. Here's another one. Ég gleymdi því sem þú sagðir, which would translate to I forgot what you said, or more directly, I forgot that which you said. And one more example. Hún vildi tala við þann sem hún hitti í gær, would translate to, she wanted to talk with the one she met yesterday. In this case, þann is a pronoun, and the relative clause, sem hún hitti í gær, is describing the pronoun. All right, let's move on to our next use of sem, which is to mean as or like. More particularly, it means in the role of. For example, hún vinnur sem verkfræðingur would mean she works as an engineer or in the role of an engineer. Brauðið var hart sem steinn would translate to the bread was hard like a rock or hard as a rock. Ég heppin að eiga þig sem vin would be I'm lucky to have you as a friend. All right, let's talk now about the third use of sem, which is to express the idea of whatever, whenever, wherever, whoever, or however. Using sem to express these ideas is actually, it's mostly like using a relative clause. It's just a kind of particular way to use it, so we're just going to look at some examples. So to say whatever, you're going to say hvað sem. Whenever, you're going to say hvenær sem. Wherever, there are different ways to say where in Icelandic. You've maybe learned to talk about where from, and where to, and each of those can be used with sem. Hvar sem, hvert sem, or hvaðan sem. And then whoever can be said hver sem, or the different forms of hver to mean who. And however, you can say hvernig sem. So let's look at some examples. Ég ætla að fylgja þér hvert sem þú ferð. This means I'm going to follow wherever you go. Hann ekki matvandur, hann borðar hvað sem would translate to he's not picky, he'll eat whatever. And using this particular construction, hvað sem is very common to mean whatever or anything. Hvernig sem á litið hún ekki tilbúin fyrir það. This would translate to however you look at it, she's not ready for it. I hope this video was insightful in giving you some ideas of how to use the word sem. It's a very common word to use in Icelandic, especially for relative clauses, because we use relative clauses all the time when we speak in most languages. So my advice to you is to keep your eyes and ears open for the word sem as you're reading and speaking Icelandic to get a better idea of how it functions. Good luck. Bless, bless.